All right, so let's dive right in. We've been getting a ton of questions about this whole everything bubble idea. Like, is it real? Are we in it? Should we be freaking out? So we're cracking open Andranik Agazarian's book, Cold War 2.0.
Specifically, Section 5, the everything bubble.
Oh,
It's a doozy.
oh, I bet. And Agazarian kicks things off with a story that'll make you want to grab your wallet and run for the hills.
It's a classic for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Buckle up, because we're going back to Holland in the 1630s, the time of Tulip Mania.
Tulip Mania. Okay, I've heard the name, but I'll be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. What went down?
So picture this. Everyone and their dog is obsessed with tulips.
Tulips, like the flowers.
Yeah, but not just any tulips. These were rare, broken tulips. They had these crazy, vibrant patterns on their petals. People were going bonkers for them.
Bonkers how?
We're talking trading these bulbs for the price of a house. A house.
You're kidding. For a single tulip bulb.
Not kidding. People were going all in, mortgaging their futures on these things.
Talk about putting all your eggs in one basket. So what happened? Did the bubble burst?
Well, it burst all right, and when it did, people lost their shirts. I mean, imagine betting everything on a flower, and then poof, it's worthless.
Ooh, that's a tough lesson to learn. So is that what we're talking about with this everything bubble? Is it just like tulip mania, but with, well, everything?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are definitely some parallels, but it's also important to remember that history doesn't always repeat itself exactly.
So should we be looking for differences too, not just similarities?
Absolutely. We need to be careful about drawing too many comparisons. Just because something happened in the past doesn't mean it's guaranteed to happen again in the exact same way.
Okay, so we can't just slap a historical template on the present. We need to be a little more nuanced.
Exactly. It's more about recognizing patterns and asking ourselves, what can we learn from this without jumping to conclusions?
Makes sense. But speaking of history and patterns, Agazarian brings up another interesting point. The rise and fall of empires. He talks about Sir John Glubb's work, The Fate of Empires. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. Glubb argues that empires, no matter how mighty, go through these predictable stages. He outlines 6, actually.
6 stages. That's a whole life cycle. What are they?
Well, it starts with the Age of Pioneers. You know, the scrappy upstarts full of energy and ambition. They're followed by the Age of Conquests, then the Age of Commerce.
So far, so good. But then it takes a turn, right?
It does. Next comes the Age of Affluence, then the Age of Intellect.
And finally,
the Age of Decadence.
The Age of Decadence. Doesn't sound so great. What does that look like, according to Glubb?
Think. A focus on material wealth over everything else. A sense of entitlement, a decline in social cohesion, a society more interested in preserving its own comfort than in facing up to challenges.
That does sound a little too familiar. And this is where things start to get a bit, unsettling, right? It's like we're catching a glimpse of a possible future, and it's not exactly sunshine and roses.
That's the power and, yeah, the danger of these historical parallels. They can be eliminating, but also it's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom. That's why it's crucial to, like we were saying, dig deeper, challenge our assumptions, and remember that the future isn't written in stone.
Okay, so we've got empires potentially on the decline, tulips driving people to financial ruin. Not exactly a sunny outlook so far.
Not exactly.
And it gets, well, even more intense.
Oh, yeah.
Because Agazarian doesn't stop there. He brings in Charles Hugh Smith, who takes this idea of collapse and breaks it down even further with what he calls the taxonomy of collapse.
Right. He lays out these different pressure points, these kind of like categories of things that can push a society towards the edge.
Categories? Okay. So, like, what are we talking about here? What could tip the scales?
Well, the first one is what Smith calls bolts from the blue. Like, picture a bolt of lightning. Totally unexpected, throws everything into chaos.
Okay, I'm getting nervous already. Give me an example.
Think pandemics. Nobody sees it coming, but suddenly, bam, everything changes. It exposes all these vulnerabilities, these cracks in the system that we never even knew were there.
Yeah, that one hits a little too close to home. So sudden shocks to the system, those bolts from the blue. What else?
Then there's resource depletion. This one's more of a slow burn. You know, it's not always as dramatic as a sudden collapse, but it can be just as devastating over time.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. We're talking about things like running out of essential resources, right?
Exactly. Things like deforestation, water scarcity, even the decline of easily accessible fossil fuels. These are all things that can really weaken the foundations of a society.
Yeah, it's like we're borrowing from the future, but what happens when there's nothing left to borrow? Okay, so we've got sudden shocks and resource depletion. What are the other pressure points?
Well, the third one, Smith calls the reversal of fortune. It's that moment when a society that was once on top, maybe they'd been riding high for a while, they start making some bad decisions, things start to go south.
Okay, so it's not just bad luck, it's bad choices that compound over time.
Exactly. It could be a series of military losses, economic blunders, or maybe they just failed to adapt to a changing world. But whatever it is, it drains their resources, saps their morale, and suddenly they're on the decline.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a tough one to come back from. It's like the saying, what goes up must come down, but it's not always a graceful descent.
Not always graceful, no. And then finally, there's the danger of, well, internal conflict.
Right, so this is less about external threats and more about what's happening within a society.
Exactly. Think political instability, civil unrest, social divisions, those things that tear a society apart from the inside out.
It's like that saying, united we stand, divided we fall. So it's not just one thing, it's this perfect storm of pressures, right? These bolts from the blue, resource depletion, reversals of fortune, and internal conflicts. It's a lot to think about.
It is. But it actually reminds me of another concept that Agazarian brings up. Have you heard of Peter Turchin and his work on historical cycles?
Vaguely, it rings a bell, but refresh my memory.
So Turchin's this historian, and he's got this theory that history moves in these long wave cycles.
Cycles, like up and down, boom and bust kind of thing.
Exactly. And he argues that these cycles are driven by these really specific forces, these kind of like underlying currents that shape the course of history.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these forces that are supposedly driving these historical cycles?
The first one is what Turchin calls labor oversupply.
Huh.
Basically, you've got way more workers than there are jobs to go around.
Right, so it's a simple supply and demand issue. Too many workers means wages stagnate or even go out, right?
Right. And then the second force is what he calls elite overproduction. Basically, you have too many highly educated, ambitious people all vying for power and influence at the top.
Ah, so it's like that old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth.
Exactly, except in this case, it's not broth that gets spoiled, it's, well, the entire system. And then the third force driving these cycles, according to Turchin, is what he calls increasing strain on state finances.
Okay, and that one sounds particularly relevant today.
It does, doesn't it? And it often manifests as things like, you guessed it, rising government debt.
Right, which seems to be a recurring theme throughout history.
It does, doesn't it? And this is where the idea of the everything bubble comes into play.
Okay, so we're in this pressure cooker of historical cycles, potential collapse, and on top of it all, this looming everything bubble. It's a lot. And then Agazarian throws another wrench in the gears with Chamath Palihapitiya.
Yeah, he's not afraid to stir the pot. And when it comes to the everything bubble, Palihapitiya's got some strong opinions. He's basically saying, we need to rip off the Band-Aid. Let some of these industries that have been propped up by cheap money, let them fail.
He's saying let them fail, just like that? Sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it?
It does sound harsh.
Yeah.
But his argument is that by constantly intervening, by bailing out companies and propping up the markets, we're actually just delaying the inevitable and making the eventual fallout even worse. He's calling for a correction, a reset. It might be painful in the short term, yeah, but he sees it as the only way to create a truly sustainable system in the long run.
So he's like, take the pain now, avoid the bigger pain later.
Exactly. He's basically saying that we've become so afraid of these natural economic cycles, these ups and downs, that we're actually making things worse by trying to engineer our way out of them.
Okay, I see what he's getting at. It's like that saying, sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. But in this case, the omelet is, well, the entire global economy. And this is where Charles Hugh Smith's prediction about a return to precious metals comes in, right?
Right. Smith believes that when or if this everything bubble pops, people are going to lose faith in those fiat currencies, the ones not backed by gold or silver.
They'll want something tangible, something with intrinsic value, something they can hold in their hands.
Right. And that's where gold and silver come in. They've been seen as stores of value for centuries.
So are we going back to the gold standard? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, it's definitely a possibility, but it's not a simple solution. I mean, who controls the gold? What about people who can't afford to buy gold?
It's not a magic bullet, that's for sure. It raises more questions than it answers, but I think that's the point of all of this, isn't it?
Yeah. We're not here to give you easy answers because there aren't any. We're here to explore these big, complex issues and hopefully give you some new perspectives to consider.
Exactly. So are we in an everything bubble? Maybe. Are there historical patterns we should be paying attention to? Definitely. Could we be on the verge of another major economic shift? It's definitely possible. But the future isn't predetermined. We have a say in how this all plays out.
The choices we make today will determine what tomorrow looks like.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to hear from you. What signs of the everything bubble are you seeing? What steps can we take to build a more resilient future? Keep those questions swirling and keep learning, deep divers.